The disappearance of 2-year-old James left everyone horrified. Surveillance cameras captured something truly chilling, something unimaginable. It all started when James disappeared from a shopping mall. His mother had let go of his hand for just a few seconds while she was buying some meat at the butcher's shop. When she looked down, he was gone. The area was full of people, dozens of shoppers, security and cameras, but James was nowhere to be found. Over 30 hours had passed since he vanished, and the concern for his safety was growing. The second night was approaching, and it was clear that he would spend it away from his family. This case shook the entire UK. The police had never faced anything like it before. On February 12, 1993, Denise Bulger received a call from her brother's girlfriend, inviting her for a stroll at the Strand shopping centre in Bootle, not far from her home in Kirby. Denise had no particular plans for the day, so she agreed. Around 3:30 p.m., she arrived at the mall with her 2-year-old son, James. It was a chilly morning, so Denise had dressed James warmly in a coat, hat, gloves, and scarf. But once inside, he quickly got too hot. Who would want to shop for groceries when the store is packed with arcade machines and interesting toys, right? Like any other child, James wandered off, curious about everything that caught his attention, running around and ignoring his mom's requests to stay close. The mall was busy as usual, even during the workday. Denise, now worried, took his hand to keep him from getting lost in the crowd. She then split from her brother's girlfriend to finish her shopping quickly and meet her outside. After running her errands with James, there was just one last store to visit. She left James's hand for a moment to get her wallet and pay for her items. When she looked down 30 seconds later, he was gone. In a panic, Denise ran to the hallway and the nearby stores to search. She asked everyone she could, "Have you seen a little boy?" But no one had. She rushed to the reception, where the staff quickly sprang into action, calling security and others who could leave their posts to help search. After 10 minutes, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to continue looking for James herself. The sympathetic manager suggested she check the toy machines and the stores James might have been drawn to. Denise dashed to check. After another half hour, both she and the mall employees realized there was no sign of the child. The manager immediately called the police, and Officer Mandy Uller, a local patrol officer who was familiar with the area, arrived shortly after. Uller's concern grew when she realized the police were called late to the scene. When a child goes missing, especially in these situations, time is of the essence. It's often referred to as the golden hour, the period when the chances of finding the missing person are highest. 40 minutes had passed since Denise realized James was gone, and they were just now putting together a description and recording his distinguishing features. Officer Uller was particularly concerned about the delay in notifying the police. At this point, every minute counted. Denise told the officer that James wasn't the type to wander off on his own. If he didn't see her around, he would likely get scared and start crying. Uller passed this information to the rest of her colleagues, who quickly arrived at the shopping center. They began combing the area, inside the mall, around the streets nearby, and along the canal. Everyone feared the worst. If James had wandered outside, he could be anywhere, even near the water. Time passed and it began to grow darker, but there was still no sign of him. As night fell, the mall closed, and the officers asked Denise to come with them to the station. She hesitated. She had this awful feeling that leaving the mall meant she would never find her son, but she agreed, and they headed to the station. Meanwhile, hundreds of police officers were continuing the search throughout the city, while others at the station went through the mall's surveillance footage. Just when the team thought they might get a break, one of the detectives thought they spotted James in a frame. The footage showed 2 teenage boys walking with James, one of them holding his hand. However, the footage wasn't clear. The cameras weren't like modern ones that record continuously. Back then, the footage would capture images every few seconds, so the detectives had to piece together multiple frames to track the boys. It took time to go through all the footage, but when they finally did, they realized something chilling. While Denise had been desperately running through the mall asking for help, her son had already been led out of the building. Just 2 minutes after Denise let go of his hand, James was taken by the 2 teenagers. The focus of the investigation immediately shifted. 2 young boys had abducted James. They led him through the mall, from one end of the first floor to the other, before exiting the building. From there, the trail went cold. There was no more footage to trace their steps, as the mall had very few cameras at the time. It was still unclear who these boys were or what they wanted with James, but this discovery provided some hope. The detectives began to speculate that maybe the boys had taken James to play, or in their minds, had simply decided to have him as a younger brother. It seemed ridiculous, but no one wanted to believe that these kids could be capable of something worse. Denise was still searching the area when the police told her they had found something. A witness claimed to have seen James with the two boys near the canal. The police were hopeful they would finally find him, but the hours passed and nothing. As the day came to a close, the search had not yielded any results. The anxiety of the situation deepened as the night stretched on, and the little boy was still missing. The police were running out of time. They feared that if James was left alone in the cold for much longer, his survival chances would decrease drastically. Meanwhile, they had to figure out who the boys were. Their team was working on identifying them, based on the surveillance footage and the descriptions given by the witnesses who saw them with James. The witnesses reported seeing them near the canal, but even then, the police were unsure whether the boys had taken James there. By the next morning, the police were more determined than ever to find James. They expanded their search, going through the entire area, including streets, parks, and waterways, hoping to find any sign of him. Despite the growing fear, they continued to hold on to the slim hope that the child might be found safe. Around midday, a call came in that would change everything. The police had received a report that a body had been found near the railway tracks, more than 2 miles from where James had gone missing. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They rushed to the scene, hoping against hope that it wasn't James. However, when they arrived, they were faced with the heartbreaking truth: the lifeless body of a young child found lying next to the tracks. The police made the grim announcement that the body was indeed that of James. He had been brutally murdered, and now the focus shifted from finding him to finding out who had done this to him. They immediately began questioning the two boys on the surveillance footage. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that these weren't ordinary kids. They had committed something horrific. John Venables and Robert Thompson, both 10 years old at the time, were soon identified as the ones responsible. The two boys had abducted James, and it was later revealed that they had not only abducted him, but also brutally assaulted him, causing his death. The brutality of their crimes stunned the entire nation. For weeks after the discovery of James's body, the whole country was in shock. How could such young children be capable of such violence? The community, the police, and even the families of the perpetrators struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. People were angry, devastated, and deeply shaken by the cruelty of the crime. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that the two boys, John Venables and Robert Thompson, had planned the abduction of James with a disturbing level of carelessness. They had lured him away from the butcher's shop where he had been with his mother, and once they were out of the shopping mall, they took him through the streets of Bootle, eventually reaching a more secluded area near the railway tracks. It was here that their cruelty would manifest in its most shocking form. John and Robert, despite their young age, had exhibited behaviors that suggested something much darker beneath the surface. They had a history of skipping school and committing small acts of mischief, but no one could have predicted the depth of their malevolence. It was later revealed that they had both been exposed to violent imagery and behaviors at home, and their relationship seemed to encourage one another's worst impulses. The brutality with which they treated James made it clear that their actions weren't the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated series of events that led to one of the most heinous crimes in the history of the UK. During their interviews, the two boys gave conflicting accounts of what happened that day. Initially, they denied any involvement, but as the evidence mounted, their stories began to fall apart. At first, John Venables insisted he had not been at the shopping centre with Robert and James, but security footage clearly showed them there, walking through the mall and even touching the child. Their alibis quickly disintegrated, and as more evidence came to light, it became impossible for them to deny their role in James's death. The detectives and the public were desperate for answers. How could two children so young be capable of committing such a vile act? What could have driven them to abduct, torture, and murder a helpless toddler? As the investigation progressed, the police found that the boys had been well aware of their actions. They had, in a twisted way, planned the abduction, and while they initially claimed they had taken James for a harmless reason, their actions betrayed a darker truth. The brutality of the crime was not just in the act itself, but in the aftermath. John and Robert attempted to cover their tracks. After beating James, they tried to make it look like an accident. They left his body near the railway tracks, hoping that a train would run over him and destroy any evidence. But their plan didn't go as they hoped. The body was discovered, and the truth came to light. The police were now not only investigating a kidnapping and murder, but also trying to understand how two young children could have been responsible for such a brutal act. The entire community of Bootle, as well as the wider UK, was in shock. People couldn't comprehend how such young children with seemingly normal lives could be capable of such violence. In the weeks that followed, there was an outpouring of grief from the public, and calls for justice grew louder. As the trial approached, the country watched closely. The details of the crime were too much for many to bear. James had been brutally beaten, struck with bricks and other objects, before being left to die near the railway tracks. The public was outraged. How could this happen? And how could the perpetrators be so young? John and Robert's trial began in November 1993. As expected, the case sparked national debate about juvenile crime and the justice system. The key question that lingered throughout the trial was whether these two boys truly understood the consequences of their actions. Were they aware of the severity of the crime they had committed, or were they too young to fully grasp the gravity of what they had done? The defense argued that they were children, and as such should be treated differently from adults in the legal system. But the prosecution contended that their actions were not those of innocent children, but of young criminals who had made a calculated decision to take the life of an innocent child. In the end, the jury found John Venables and Robert Thompson guilty of the murder of James Bulger. The sentencing, however, caused a public outcry. The judge decided that they should be held accountable for their crime, but because of their age, they would not face life in prison. Instead, they were given a minimum sentence of 8 years. This sentence shocked the nation, especially when it was revealed that the boys would not serve time in a traditional adult prison. Instead, they would be placed in a juvenile detention facility until they turned 18, after which they would be released. The decision to allow them to serve such a short sentence sparked widespread outrage. Many believed that justice had not been served. How could two children who had committed such a horrific crime be allowed to return to society so soon? This question gnawed at the public conscience, and the debate over juvenile justice became more heated than ever. In the years following the trial, there was a constant outcry from the public for the boys to be held accountable for their actions. The family of James Bulger, devastated by the loss of their son, vowed to continue fighting for justice. They could not understand how the two boys could be allowed to go free after taking the life of their child. And for many in the UK, the case of James Bulger became a symbol of the failures of the justice system and a warning about the dangers of unchecked violence in children. The public outcry following the sentencing of John Venables and Robert Thompson grew stronger by the day. Many felt that the justice system had failed to deliver an appropriate punishment for the brutal murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. The boys had not only abducted, tortured, and murdered James, but they had done so with a shocking degree of cruelty. Their actions, combined with their young age, left the entire country grappling with a painful moral dilemma. How could society punish two children for such a horrific crime while still considering them minors? As the years passed, the story of James's murder continued to haunt the nation. Every few months, new updates would emerge about the case, and the public would be reminded of the terrible loss. The Bulger family, particularly Denise, James's mother, was left to cope with the unbearable grief of losing her son in such a brutal and senseless way. No matter how much time passed, she could not shake the memories of that fateful day when James was taken from her. The pressure on the justice system increased as the boys neared their release. Many questioned how they could ever be truly rehabilitated, especially after committing such a brutal act at such a young age. There was a growing concern that they would re-enter society with a dark history that could lead to further harm to others. This fear was amplified by the lack of clarity on what would happen to Venables and Thompson once they were released. Although their identities were protected by the law, some felt that they should not be allowed to live out their lives in anonymity, given the severity of their crime. As the release dates for John Venables and Robert Thompson approached, the British public was gripped with fear. News outlets began to speculate about their whereabouts, and people began to wonder if they were really being reformed or if they were still dangerous. The debate over their release became even more heated when Venables and Thompson attempted to reintegrate into society after serving their sentences in juvenile detention. Their release from detention was heavily monitored, with both boys being given new identities in order to protect them from public backlash. Despite their new identities, however, The fear that they might commit another crime lingered. There was a growing sense that the boys had not truly been rehabilitated, and many feared that they would be a danger to society in the future. In the years following their release, the media kept close tabs on their movements. Reports about them surfaced periodically, and the public remained divided over whether they should have been given a second chance or whether their punishment should have been more severe. John Venables, in particular, seemed to struggle with his reintegration into society. After his release, he was placed under strict monitoring, and he was regularly required to meet with social workers and psychologists. It soon became clear that Venables had not fully come to terms with the enormity of his actions. In fact, reports suggested that he had struggled with his own sense of guilt and shame, but was also unable to understand the true impact of what he had done. In 2010, Venables found himself back in the criminal justice system after being arrested on charges of possessing child pornography. This shocking turn of events raised many questions about the effectiveness of the juvenile rehabilitation system and whether people like Venables and Thompson could truly be reformed. Despite having received therapy and support during his time in detention, Venables' arrest indicated that he had not been fully rehabilitated. His behavior suggested that he had not learned the appropriate moral and social lessons during his time in the system. This setback not only caused further public outrage, but also led to calls for stricter monitoring of released offenders. Venables was sentenced to prison again, but this time he was facing a much more serious charge. His arrest was a clear indication that his rehabilitation had failed, and that the justice system had not been able to break the cycle of criminal behavior that began with his involvement in James Bulger's death. It raised important questions about how young offenders are treated and whether enough is being done to address the underlying psychological issues that contribute to violent behavior. Meanwhile, Robert Thompson, while also receiving psychological treatment, appeared to live a more low-key life. He managed to avoid any major incidents and stayed out of the public eye for the most part. However, his past continued to haunt him. Although he was never caught committing any more crimes, the public was still fearful that he might one day return to his violent ways. For many, the fact that he had taken part in such a brutal crime when he was just a child made it difficult to believe that he could truly change. The families of both boys were also impacted by their crimes. While the Thompson family seemed to continue their lives with some degree of normalcy, the Venables family faced an intense amount of scrutiny. John's return to prison was a blow to his family, but it also caused them immense emotional distress as they struggled to deal with the fallout from his actions. His mother, in particular, was forced to confront the reality that her son had taken part in one of the most brutal murders in British history. As time went on, the public continued to wrestle with the implications of the James Bulger case. The tragedy highlighted deep flaws in the criminal justice system, particularly in terms of how young offenders are treated. It also raised important questions about the nature of rehabilitation and the long-term consequences of violent crime. Many people still struggle to come to terms with the fact that two children, so young, could commit such a heinous act, and that they would be allowed to return to society after such a brief period of incarceration. Denise Bulger, James's mother, continued to fight for justice and to raise awareness about the dangers of violence in young children. She dedicated much of her life to campaigning for better protection for children and more stringent laws around juvenile offenders. Despite the passage of time, her pain and grief never seemed to fade. James was always on her mind, and she continued to honor his memory through her advocacy work. But the question of whether justice had truly been served remained unanswered for many. In the years following their release, both John Venables and Robert Thompson faced immense public scrutiny. The case of James Bulger remained a touchstone for debates on juvenile crime, rehabilitation, and whether society could ever truly come to terms with such a devastating loss. While many were hopeful that Venables and Thompson might have learned from their horrific actions, the reality was far more complicated. The shadow of their crime hung over them, and any attempt at reintegration into society was met with resistance, suspicion, and the haunting question of whether they could ever truly change. After John Venables' arrest in 2010 for possessing child pornography, the narrative surrounding his future took a drastic turn. The news sent shockwaves through the media, further igniting public outrage. His criminal history, which began with the brutal murder of James, now included a disturbing incident involving child pornography. This revelation threw into question the effectiveness of the juvenile rehabilitation system, especially for children who had committed violent crimes. Critics argued that a failure in the system had allowed Venables to return to a life of criminal behavior, despite the treatment he had received during his time in juvenile detention. The arrest of Venables raised critical concerns about the system's ability to prevent future offenses from juvenile offenders. It highlighted the need for a deeper understanding of the psychological conditions that underlie violent behavior, particularly in children who commit heinous acts at a young age. For many, Venables' return to prison signaled the grim reality that rehabilitation was not always successful, especially in cases involving deeply disturbed individuals. While Venables' story took a tragic turn, the public was left wondering whether the justice system had failed to fully address his needs. Was the treatment he received enough to address the underlying psychological issues that had led to his violent behavior? Or had the system simply put a band-aid on a much deeper wound? The question lingered as society struggled with its expectations for juvenile offenders. In contrast, Robert Thompson's post-release life seemed to take a quieter, less controversial path. While he remained under the radar, living with the stigma of his past, there were no further reports of criminal activity. His case seemed to suggest that some offenders might manage to reintegrate into society without returning to criminal behavior, but the haunting truth remained that Thompson had been part of a murder so brutal that many could not shake the fear of what he was capable of. Both boys, now adults, continued to live under a cloud of suspicion. Although they were given new identities to protect them from the backlash, the media and the public were always eager to find out where they were, what they were doing, and whether they had truly changed. For many, it was impossible to separate their past from their present, and the fear that they might reoffend never fully dissipated. For the Bulger family, the pain of losing James never truly left. James had been a beautiful, innocent child, full of life and curiosity. To know that he had been taken from them in such a horrific way, and that the perpetrators were now walking free, was a constant source of anguish. Denise Bulger, James's mother, became an outspoken advocate for justice, using her voice to raise awareness about child protection and the treatment of young offenders. She dedicated much of her life to campaigning for stricter laws on juvenile crime and was especially vocal about the need for changes to the justice system. Denise argued that the legal system had failed her son, and she continued to push for greater accountability in cases involving juvenile offenders. She also advocated for more comprehensive support for victims' families, who were often left to navigate the aftermath of such crimes without the resources they needed to heal. Despite the immense personal grief she endured, Denise remained determined to honor James's memory by speaking out on behalf of other families who had suffered similar losses. Her advocacy work eventually led to the establishment of the James Bulger Memorial Trust, an organization that supports children and families affected by violent crime. Through this trust, Denise was able to offer assistance to those who had been victimized and help them find the strength to rebuild their lives. As the years went on, public interest in the case began to wane, but for those who had followed the events closely, the questions lingered. Was justice ever truly served for James Bulger? Could anyone who had committed such a heinous act ever be truly rehabilitated? And, most painfully of all, what had happened to two young boys who were capable of such brutality? Were they now just products of a broken system? Or did they have the potential to live normal lives? In 2017, a shocking update emerged when it was revealed that John Venables had been arrested again, this time for violating the conditions of his parole. He was caught with inappropriate images on his computer, bringing his history of criminal behavior back to the forefront. The revelation left the public questioning whether Venables had ever truly been reformed, or if he had simply been hiding behind the facade of rehabilitation. The decision to incarcerate him again was met with mixed reactions. While some believed that he had shown no remorse and should be kept away from society for good, others argued that he had been given inadequate support and that society had failed him once again. It was clear that the cycle of criminal behavior had not been broken, and Venables' arrest added a new layer of complexity to the debate on juvenile justice. By this point, Robert Thompson had largely faded from the public eye. His past remained a shadow that followed him wherever he went, but there were no reports of further criminal activity. Unlike Venables, Thompson seemed to have avoided reoffending, but the damage caused by his role in James's death was irreversible. The question of whether Thompson had truly changed remained unanswered, and his future remained uncertain. As for James's family, their fight for justice continued. In 2020, they launched another petition demanding that Venables and Thompson's identities be made public, believing that it was vital for society to know who these men were, given the severity of their past crimes. Despite the efforts to keep their identities secret, the Bulger family remained resolute in their stance, convinced that transparency and accountability were necessary for true justice. Through all the years of pain, loss, and public scrutiny, the Bulger family's message remained clear. James's life mattered, and his story would never be forgotten. The battle for justice, for James, and for other children like him continued to fuel Denise's determination to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again.